I want to thank everyone for attending. This is the final version, final episode of the CROWE Fall Webinar Series. Again, just a little bit of background. My name is Noah Williams, Professor of Economics here at UW-Madison and Director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, also known as CROWE. CROWE was started in the fall of 2017, and we focus on state-level economic and policy issues with particular interest in Wisconsin, but not solely about Wisconsin factors. Because Wisconsin played such an important role in 2016 and has at least so far been pivotal as well in 2020 in the presidential election, we thought it was worthwhile spending some time delving into some of the economic issues at play in the 2020 election. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, they're all available on our website, crowe.wisc.edu. The recordings are all up there, and we'll have the recording from tonight up there as well in a couple of days. Just want to highlight as well that this is a good lead-in to the home stretch of the presidential election with the final debate coming up tomorrow. A little bit of ground rules before I introduce the speaker. If anyone has any questions as we go along, type them in on the chat. My colleagues and I will read through them, summarize them, and ask them to our speaker, Alan Blinder. And if anyone is interested, or let me just say that more forcefully, I encourage everyone who is interested to stick around afterwards. One of the things which is missing from these virtual events is the possibility to have some personal interaction with each other and with the speaker. So at 8 o'clock, we'll wrap things up, shut the recording off, and we'll allow for some more informal interaction. So again, I encourage everyone to stick around for that. So the topic of the webinar tonight is the economy in 2020 and prospects for a Biden administration. And our speaker, we're happy to welcome Alan Blinder. Alan is the Gordon S. Rentschler Memorial Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's been on the Princeton faculty since 1971, taking time off from January 1993 to 1996 to serve in the US government, first as a member of President Clinton's original Council of Economic Advisors, and then as Vice Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Just a short story, I was actually a research assistant at the Fed when Alan was vice chairman there. And I still remember, I don't know if he does, his Christmas poem, which ended, Merry Christmas to all and to all a rate hike. Alan has extensive experience in policy, in politics, and in government. In addition to his academic writings, including important work on monetary policy, fundamental work on inventory investment, and work on credit markets, he's long had a best-selling introductory textbook with Bill Baumol, and he's long written for a broader audience. This includes many popular books, newspapers, magazine columns, including recently his regular column in the Wall Street Journal. He also appears frequently on television, PBS, CNBC, CNN, and others. His most recent book, which I have on the shelf behind me there, is Advice and Dissent, Why America Suffers When Economics and Politics Collide. And that includes reflections on his time in public service and ideas on how economics can better serve the policy process. So with that introduction, we're happy to have Alan Blinder here to talk about the current state of the economy and what economic policies would look like under a Biden administration. So I'll now turn it over to Alan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Noah. At this point, I would usually say, if this was the real world, it's nice to be here in Madison. I guess it's nice to be here virtually in Madison, though I've been reading about the plight of Wisconsin lately in with the COVID pandemic, and it sadly reminds me we had our turn with the real horrible part of this pandemic very early, way back in March, April in New Jersey, though not so much in Princeton, but in the state, and it was terrible. So I wish you all well. Now I'm going to share the screen as I've got some slides. So the subject, as Noah just said, is Joe Biden's economic policies. And this will be quick, even though I have slides. Sometimes slides are a signal. This is going to be a long, long talk. It won't be. First, this is my most important slide. I am not a campaign insider. I'm not working on the campaign. I'm not constantly on the phone with the campaign or anything like that. And most importantly, I don't speak for the campampaign. So,
excuse me, Alan.
Actually, the slides don't seem to be showing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
They were earlier, but.
Are they showing in that screen?
Now.
No. Huh. All right, let me click this off and try this again. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Now, are you seeing me?
Yes.
All right, you're seeing me. That's half. Now, let me do share screen. I think this is the same thing I did before. How about,
there we go.
Yeah, now you are.
Yes.
All right, you know, I think I won't put it on full screen. Don't ask me why, but somehow that did something bad. So as I was saying, I'm not a part of the campaign. I don't speak for the campaign. That's mainly it's the disclosure, but it's partly an excuse for me, because if somebody asks me some picayune detail about what's in the Biden platform, I may not know the answer. I'll answer if I know the answer. Now, since I'm not on. All right, I may have to change the pages that way. So I want to start, because Noah asked me this when he invited me, whenever that was, to first look back at the recent record under President Trump. And I'm going to do the pre-COVID part of the Trump record, because everything went to hell, as we all know, when COVID came in a serious way to the United States. The economy was good before that. And as you all know, President Trump wishes to take 100% credit for that. So does he deserve it? I think the answer is no. You know, I'm going to make one more shot at putting this on. Are we still good? Okay.
Yes.
All right, very good. I don't know what happened before. So this is a graph showing you the US unemployment rate from the time it first started to decline at the end of 2010 through until February of this year. I stop it there because then you know what COVID did to this unemployment rate. It shot it way off the screen here. And I challenge you, this graph is in my Wall Street Journal column for today by coincidence, which just came out online a few hours ago. The challenge is to look at that without looking at the time dimension and try to tell when President Trump became president. I think it's impossible. That's the answer. So what you've basically had, it's not quite linear, but a steady decline at a pretty steady pace in the unemployment rate through the last several years of the Obama administration, well, the last 5 years, and the first 3 years of the Trump administration until COVID hit. It's hard for me to look at evidence like that and say, well, Trump did it. We were in the soup before, and whatever he did, it must have been great. You can also look at GDP numbers instead of a graph. I'm just putting some numbers here on the screen. The last 3 years, the last 12 Trump quarters before the pandemic hit, was a period in which the average real GDP growth in the United States was 2.5%. We all remember that President Trump promised a huge acceleration because that was a terrible number, 2.5, and we should never be content with that. And he knew how to boost it. Well, sorry, I reversed the order. what I said was right, but I should have put this number up first. The 2.4% was the number for the Obama quarters, the last 12 of them. And the first 12 Trump quarters prior to the pandemic had a marked acceleration from 2.4 to 2.5. I don't believe that is what President Trump was promising to do, but it's consistent with the graph of the unemployment rate, that the pandemic hit, things were going administration, meaning it was going decently but not fabulously, and the unemployment rate was tracking down, 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 reaching a very nice 3.5% level at the end. So what did Trump do? Well, the biggest Trump macroeconomic policy by far was the tax cut that passed in December of 2017. By the way, the president has called it, I think he still does, the largest in history, which as a share of GDP is a ludicrous claim. As a share of GDP, it's on the order of a third of the Reagan tax cut, for example. But in real numbers, about a 1% of GDP tax cut. That's what it was. Now, I don't want to sneer at that. GDP is a big number. 1% of GDP is a big number. It was a sizable tax cut, but perhaps the most regressive in history. Now, I'm virtually in Madison, Wisconsin, where I think most people don't think regressive is a good thing. I can imagine talking in other venues where people would say, oh, most regressive in history, that's great. But my experience suggests that's not true in Madison, and it's not true in my own personal attitude either. This last line to me is still amazing. It's hard to cut taxes by a large amount, and 1% of GDP is a large amount, and find that the public doesn't like it, which has been the consistent finding in polling about this tax cut since it was passed and continuing to this day. It's not a very popular policy, and I guess that's one reason why President Trump's not really running on it. Now, what he would do, I did look at some of what you saw from Casey Mulligan and others. Conservative economists tend to laud Trump on the regulatory, deregulatory front, and he did do quite a bit of deregulation, some of it by executive orders, some of it just by ignoring the law as if it wasn't there, and some of it by just not enforcing, very lax enforcement. But it added up to a considerable amount of tacit deregulation without, by the way, going through Congress. Now, the way we teach our children that policy gets changed, including regulatory policy, is the president or somebody proposes a change in the law to Congress, and Congress says, oh yes, the environmental protection laws are much too tough, they're bad for business, we should change them. Basically nothing like that has happened during the Trump administration. There's practically been nothing done by Congress, but there has been a lot done by executive order and those other things that I mentioned a moment ago. So that's looking back at the Trump record. What I mainly want to do, what I was mainly asked to do and will do, is compare Biden and Trump. But before I do that, there are two very important preliminaries that are a preface to what I'm going to say after. The first is that this is a harder job than it sounds like, because there is no Trump platform to which to compare the Biden platform. You could go on the Biden website and find, my God, you find a lot. Pages, and I didn't try to count. It goes on and on and on. Loads of policies that constitute, I just looked at the economic part of the Biden platform. There's nothing like that for Trump. You may remember during the Republican convention, a lot of the commentariat mentioned that the Republicans didn't bother to adopt a platform, which was kind of weird. They decided their platform was whatever Donald Trump was going to say in the coming months. And I guess there it is their platform. So there's a huge amount in the Biden platform, and I will not bore you by trying to go over the whole thing, nor could I. I'm going to hit a few of the big issues after one more slide and express the hope. You all know where I stand on Biden versus Trump. That's why, and I was invited. It's not hidden. I was invited. You had people on the other side, so I was invited to take the Biden side. And the hope here is that you can beat nothing with something, right? There's an old cliche: you can't beat something with nothing. But hopefully you can beat nothing with something. And in terms of an economic platform, Trump has presented nothing. As you probably also know, he's been on a few notable interviews with the likes of Sean Hannity that try to pitch him a softball about what did he want to do in his second term, and there was no answer, basically. So we are trying to beat nothing with something. Second preliminary is that Biden believes in working things through Congress, not pretending there is no such thing as Congress. He hopes, of course, that he'll have a Democratic majority in the Senate. Everybody's taking for granted, and I do too, that there'll be a Democratic majority in the House. The Senate is up for grabs. That may be under Democratic or Republican control in the next presidential term. Nobody knows yet. But I want to make a few points under this head. And the main point is on the screen right now. No president has ever gotten everything he campaigned on or wanted to do through the Congress. This is a bipartisan statement. Doesn't matter if it's a Republican president or a Democratic president. Some have done better than others. Franklin Roosevelt got quite a few things through Congress. Ronald Reagan got quite a few things through Congress. Some other presidents didn't get very much through Congress, often because it was controlled by the opposite party. But nobody ever gets everything he campaigns on through Congress. And it may be a surprise to Donald Trump, but there is a US Congress. So you need to apply a steep discount. If you're trying to forecast, for example, what would be the economic policy in a Biden administration, you want to start with the platform, but you want to apply a steep discount because you know that he's not going to get everything that he'd like to do. Now, there are two variants of this steep discount. If there's a democratically controlled Senate, Will Rogers knew what is likely to happen. If you don't know, this is one of my favorite political quotes by Will Rogers, and it's the fact that it was so long ago and yet it's still apropos of the Democratic Party today is, I don't know what, marvelous, miraculous, terrible, pick your own adjective. Anyway, some of you may know, Will Rogers said when asked about his affiliation, he says, I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. And the Democrats were like that in Will Rogers' days, and they're like that now. So that's the version of why Biden won't get everything if there's a democratically controlled Senate. The Republican version, if the Republican-controlled Senate, is much simpler. It's Mitch McConnell standing there like a brick wall or a cement wall, opposing everything, as he did during the Obama administration. So, as I said, Biden hopes for a Democratic majority. He'll get a lot more through Congress if he gets one. If he doesn't, he's going to have the same problem with McConnell that Barack Obama had. Okay. With all that put aside as preliminaries, let me talk about some of the Biden economic proposals. And as it says here, selected. I already warned you that you can go on the website and find 16,000 policies. I'm just going to look at a handful. So the first doesn't sound like economic policy at all until you think about it, which is handling the pandemic. And when you think about it, you realize, I think almost every economist agrees with this statement, that better performance against the pandemic will lead to better economic performance. And conversely, worse performance against the pandemic, which is what we're having now, will lead to worse economic outcomes. So the Biden policies on the pandemic are indeed public health policies. I wouldn't want to deny that, but they're also economic policies. So what are some of them? Well, first, some of what they're not. Biden is not going for herd immunity. By now he's heard of Scott Atlas, but Scott Atlas will be gone from the White House in a Biden administration. He will not be, and you've heard him say this, he will not be disparaging or ignoring what the scientists said, but rather following what the scientists have to say, including simple things like testing, wearing masks, social distancing, etc., but also more complicated things like the therapeutics that we hope will come sooner rather than later, but who knows, and the vaccine, or vaccines, I think I probably should say, that will also come sooner or later, and we hope sooner. I want to emphasize, because this has already been a big deal in the campaign, that the President of the United States does not have the authority to shut down the economy. Every time I see President Trump screaming at one of these pep rallies that he likes to run, he talks about Joe Biden will just close down the economy. First of all, Joe Biden doesn't want to close down the economy. But the more fundamental point is the President of the United States does not have that authority. What's going to be shut and open in the state of Wisconsin depends mostly on the governor of the state of Wisconsin, I guess secondarily on the legislature, and not even tertiarily on the President of the United States. But importantly to me, and probably to you, the President of the United States does have a bully pulpit unmatched by anybody else and can exert moral leadership. So while Biden could not shut down the economy if he wanted to, he may well encourage governors that are inclined to backslide a little bit on the openings of their economies to do so, where the governor and he deem it appropriate. But there will not be a shutdown of the economy. Second policy, taxes. It is true that Biden wants to raise taxes, and in right of center circles and in far right circles, that's like the cardinal sin. If you use the T word, they want you to banish you from the dinner table and go to bed without supper. And it is true that Biden is advocating higher taxes, but let's go a little bit more deeply behind the headline. If you look at the plan, the total 10-year magnitude of tax increases is about 2.4 trillion. That's again roughly 1% of GDP, which is to say roughly the same as the amount that the Trump policies cut taxes. So in magnitudes, in detail, there will be many differences, but in gross magnitudes, it's basically going back to the level of taxation when Donald Trump was elected and became president. So it's not, we're not going to look at, we're not going to have the tax rates of Sweden or Germany or any of those Western European countries under Biden's proposals. And again, I want to remind you in this context, if he gets all of this through Congress, it will be a near miracle. Second qualifier here is that in the program, if you look at it, there are a whole bunch of tax cuts and tax credits and subsidies and things like that, amounting, if you add it up, to about half of the 2.4 trillion. So the net tax increase that Biden is proposing is about 1.2 trillion over 10 years, or about 0.5% of GDP in round numbers, which doesn't exactly sound like a social democratic revolution, Sweden and the US. Next thing I want to say about that is it's often said that Biden promises to repeal the Trump tax cuts. And if you only look at the number 2.4 trillion and 1% of GDP and compare that with what Trump did, it looks like, one president giveth, the other taketh away, the same amount. But in fact, if you look at some of the details, the Biden proposal is not for full repeal of the Trump tax cuts. And I just put here for the two biggest reasons. There are others. The first is that the tax cuts for people earning below $400,000 a year, which were not that big, by the way, but anyway, they were there, are going to stay. Biden is not proposing to end those. So if you earn $300,000 a year and you got a tax reduction of, whatever, $3,000 a year out of the Trump tax cuts, you'll keep it. But if you're over 400,000, you're going to lose the benefits that. On the side, tax would mean going back from 21% basic rate to 35%. Biden is only proposing to go halfway to 28%. So that's a big difference from full repeal. And by the way, this is especially for the economists in the audience, which I'm guessing is a lot of this audience. At least the way we teach the cost of capital to students, and I think the basic framework that we believe in, once you have expensing in the tax code, the corporate tax rate hardly matters. Lowering it is basically a lump sum giveaway to corporations. Raising it is like analogous to a lump sum tax. That's not generically true, but if you have expensing, it's true. And so it's not so clear if the expensing stays, and most of it will under Biden, bumping the tax rate back to 28% is pretty close to a non-distorting revenue increaser from corporations, or more accurately from the shareholders of those corporations. So the short of this slide is, yes, taxation under Biden will be different than taxation over Trump, but not as much as some of the screaming headlines suggest. That could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your attitude. Oh, and I should say, what is true is that the top marginal rate on individuals would go up substantially. So I have a lot of friends that pay the top marginal rate on individuals. I do myself, and we're going to face a higher tax rate for sure. Then there's climate change. This is another big deal. We all know the Trump attitudes about climate change. It's all a hoax. It used to be a Chinese hoax. I'm not sure if it's still a Chinese hoax. He pulled us immediately out of the Paris Accord, etc. The Biden attitude is this is far from a hoax, but an existential problem. Literally, the fate of humanity is riding on whether we're going to do anything about climate change or just fry the planet. He will certainly put us back into the Paris Accord. I think he can do that immediately. I don't think he needs Congress. I should have checked that before I spoke. I believe that's right, but I'm not 100% sure. If you look at those page after page of Biden proposals that are on his website, there's a very large emphasis and a lot of money spent on investments in clean energy and in clean infrastructure, green infrastructure, et cetera. So this is a very major part of the spending part. This is a very major piece of the spending part of the Biden economic plan, spending on energy conservation and infrastructure. There are two things here that have been talked about a lot that I want to make clear. Joe Biden has uttered a number of friendly words about the Green New Deal, but he has not embraced it. If you read these hundreds of pages on the website, nowhere does he embrace the Green New Deal as it was introduced a while back by Ed Markey and AOC. I have actually read that. Not too many economists read that and say it's wonderful. But regardless of what economists think, Joe Biden has not embraced it, although, every 2 hours Donald Trump says he has. It's not true. Donald Trump also keeps saying that there'll be no fracking in the Biden administration. Biden will not ban fracking. Now, folks here in Wisconsin may be on the other side of that issue and want him to ban fracking. In places like Pennsylvania, they don't want to, or at least a lot of people don't want to see fracking banned. Regardless of what's the right policy on this, the Biden policy is not to ban fracking, period. So that could be good or bad. This last line is important. It relates to the taxes. He does not advocate a carbon tax to solve or ameliorate the climate plan. If he had asked me as an economist, I already told you I'm not part of the campaign, I would have said you should do that. But that's terrible political advice. But it's good economic advice. So people could be on both sides of the fracking issue. As far as I know, every economist thinks we need a carbon tax to help on the climate change policy, but Joe Biden is not. That is not part of the Biden plan. Next issue I want to mention is a little more briefly is inequality. It would seem to be a crazy thing to give a talk, quote, in Madison and not mention poverty and inequality. Joe Biden wants to make the tax transfer system more progressive. I talked some about the tax part of that. There's a bunch of proposals on the transfer side of that, one of which is boosting Social Security benefits for low-income recipients, and there's a bunch of other things as well. He also wants to restore labor rights and strengthen unions. As those of you paying any attention to this know, the NLRB has been completely gutted in the Trump, or neutered, I guess I should say, in the Trump administration. Joe Biden would like to see that come roaring back and pay attention to the rights of workers and to the strength of unions. And the last thing I want to talk about, this is me personally, I don't think this is one of the top 5 issues, but Noah mentioned I once was at the Federal Reserve, as was he. This is important to me. And in general, if you're interested in macroeconomics, this is important to you also, who's running the Fed. There's an irony here. Jerome Powell is, or was, I don't know what he feels about now, a Republican, a lifelong Republican. He worked in the George H.W. Bush administration. And well, he's what if he's still a Republican, he's what I call a good Republican, not a Trump Republican. But yet, despite that, I think his continuation in the chairmanship of the Fed, where he's doing a very good job, I might say, is more likely under Biden. That doesn't mean it's 100% sure that Biden would reappoint him, but I think the odds of Jay Powell continuing where he is higher if there's a Biden presidency than a second Trump term. And in addition to that, the appointment of Judy Shelton is an impossibility under Biden. If you don't know, so those of you who pay attention to macroeconomics and monetary economics know who Judy Shelton is. She's been nominated to the board by Federal Reserve Board by President Trump. She's a gold bug, among other things, and has written some things about the Federal Reserve that are totally outrageous. I presume she'll wind up on the board if there's a second Trump presidency, but I'm sure she won't wind up on the board if there's a Biden presidency, and that nomination has not been acted on in the lame duck. I hope it won't be. So the Fed will look different in a Biden administration than in a Trump administration, and I dare say better. So my conclusion, and I wrote here, it's a personal conclusion, is that if you just look at the economics, the case for Biden over Trump is clear. It's overwhelming to me. But I want to finish by saying I understand that economics is only part of the story. There are many, many other aspects of the Trump versus Biden presidential race, and many of them are far more important than some of these economic issues are, such as whether we're going to have a democracy in the United States of America. And since you folks live in Wisconsin, where your vote actually counts, unlike me, who I live in New Jersey, where it doesn't, I could vote 72 times and it wouldn't matter. Please go vote if you haven't already. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. We really appreciate it. I know we've had a number of questions come in on the chat. Again, continue to add those. We'll get to those in just a second. I wanted to ask just a couple of follow-ups myself, and then we'll bring in some of my colleagues for the questions from the chat. So you talked about taxes, and of course, you know, Obama ran on reversing the Bush tax cuts, but there was a time of recession and political and economic realities intervened. Do you think now would be the time to increase taxes in a sort of COVID recessionary economy?
I think not right now. If I could raise a magic wand, and I can't because of Congress, but if I do a magic wand experiment, I would do a rapid reform of the tax code to change the tax burdens and the tax advantages in a whole list of ways, most of which couldn't get through Congress. So without the magic wand, I think what you have to realize is even if it goes quickly, there won't be any congressional action on Biden's tax proposal until next summer, next fall, or even longer, even if it goes quickly. And if Will Rogers' perspicacity holds true, it'll take longer than that. So who knows what the economy will look like a year and a half from now. It may still look weak, and if it still does, then I would take what was obviously your side in the question, Noah, saying this is not a great time to raise taxes.
And then a couple of questions that kind of tie, you know, you have both the advantage and disadvantage of coming at the end of this webinar series where we've brought up a number of issues. There was a couple of points I wanted to think about. One, Brian Riedel, who was one of our previous guests, talked quite a bit about the long-term budgetary problems and projected deficits going way out. And at least, again, even applying appropriate discounts for Congress, it looks like the Biden agenda would make that problem worse. Do you agree with that? And what do you think about, I think we're probably all in agreement the deficit doesn't really matter too much right now, but how do we move from now towards the future?
Right. I'm not sure I agree with the premise that the Biden proposal would make it worse. I think a little bit, if it all got through exactly as it is, you probably would have a little bit of an increase in the budget deficit, which, as you just suggested, Noah, and I agree, would probably be a good thing right now rather than a bad thing. Right now, much more of it hinges on what will happen with the next COVID relief package, which, as you know, Congress is dickering about right now. Trump wants to go big, at least that's what he says. But you wonder, I mentioned this in my Wall Street Journal piece today, if he ever talks to Mitch McConnell about that. And just in general, I think he has, well, to the extent he pays attention to policy at all, he has a little bit of George W. Bushism in him. You may remember that the basic economic budgetary principle of the George W. Bush administration was cut taxes, spend a lot, and never pay for anything. Wars, Medicare Part D, tax cut, everything. So, and it's been the Democrats, actually, that have stood up, to the extent anybody stood up, for some restraint and paying some attention to budget deficits. So I'm not so sure. I think you're right that the Biden platform would raise the deficit a bit. I'm not so sure that that would be a bigger increase than would happen in a second Trump term.
Okay, fair enough. And then I had one kind of broader question, I guess, about how Biden fits into the current Democratic Party. And, you know, one of the I guess, concerns a number of people have is that the Democratic Party has moved, I think, significantly left, certainly from your days in the Clinton administration. I think, Biden himself and the proposals are, not as far left, certainly as the others in the Democratic primary. But I guess, broadly speaking, the relationship between, if there is, say, a Democratic Congress, how influential do you think they will be in driving the agenda versus the executive? Just say some words along those lines.
Yeah, so let me start with the latter, because I sort of touched it in talking. Even if there's a Democratic majority in the Senate, and assuming there will be a strong majority in the House, the Democrats in the Congress are not going to roll over and have Joe Biden scratch him on the belly like a golden retriever or something like that. They have their own ideas. Some of them are very far to the left of Joe Biden, and a smaller number are rather far to the right of Joe Biden, right? Remember, in terms of who's the big tent party, the Democratic Party ranges from AOC and the squad on the left to Joe Manchin and a few others like that on the right. It's a huge, huge range. Joe Biden sits somewhat squarely in the middle of that. If I take you back to try to remember, you probably all try to forget because there were so many, to the original field of approximately infinite number of Democratic candidates that were vying for the nomination, Joe Biden was considered towards the right, not the extreme right. Or maybe he was, actually, I don't know. But anyway, definitely right of center within that crowd of people that were vying for the nomination. So trying to paint him as a socialist is silly. I mean, you hear that from Donald Trump, but that's silly. Is he to the left of a typical Republican? Let's just talk about the good Republicans, like I was speaking about before. Never mind the Trumpies, the sane, good Republicans. Yeah, he is to the left of people like that, for sure. And he will, for example, I mean, this is a major part of his platform, advocate raising taxes on the rich, which is kind of the acid litmus test these days. It has been since Ronald Reagan. If you say anything like that, you're drummed out of the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party, they often clap. And Joe Biden, so that is a difference. But it doesn't make him very left within the Democratic Party.
Okay, we've had a number of questions come in from the chat. I think one of my colleagues is going to jump in and handle one of those. Kim, I think first, or Simeon. I don't know who's up. Who's up first?
Well, why don't I go first? So there were a couple of questions that are probably related, and they tie back to something that you mentioned early on, Alan, which was one area in which Trump got something accomplished was in the area of deregulation. Now, we may debate about how he did it, but he did get something done. And the question was along the lines of, is there any evidence to suggest that these deregulatory steps actually had some sort of significant impact on macroeconomic performance? Were there any growth effects? Were there any level effects, one time, more permanent? So I'm not sure if you're from your vantage point, you can maybe speak to that. I guess some of the people in the audience would like to hear about that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there were some effects. And I know I glanced at his slide that Casey Mulligan was making a big deal about that in the when he was speaking in this series. I'll say just a couple of things. First, to harken back to that slide I showed you, aggregate macroeconomic growth accelerated from 2.4% to 2.5%. Now, if somebody wants to tell me that 0.1 was because of deregulation, that could be. That could be. But there's a cost of this. I like to, when I teach about this subject, which I don't much, it's not the area that I teach Princeton students about. But when I do, I draw a sharp distinction between health and safety regulation on the one hand and sort of price and entry and environmental protection on the other hand. On that second hand, regulation is often making the market work better. In the case of environmental externalities is the most example. In the first case, the price and entry regulation, it's almost always making the market work worse. So you want to minimize that stuff. As I look at the panoply of things that the Trump administration has done under deregulation, they have a lot to do with environmental degradation. They have a lot to do with eviscerating labor rights. They don't have a lot to do with, trucking deregulation. Was a long time in the past, and the advocates of it were right. But it doesn't have much to do with price and entry regulation, which is a source of inefficiency. And in more cases than not, both economists on the left and on the right agree that we should get rid of it. But we did get rid of it decades ago. There's not much of it. Much of it left. I guess one thing I left out, and I shouldn't have, is financial regulation. I mean, financial regulation is an interesting case where you certainly can make an argument that Dodd-Frank and other things that came in under the Democrats caused most of, I don't know, not everybody in this audience is an economist. We call them deadweight losses, losses of efficiency, forcing firms in the industry, banks, to do things differently than they wanted to do them. But there was a reason for doing that, which is because under the old regime, they drove us almost over the cliff. And so you could think of that as analogous to health and safety regulations, the health and safety of the banking system. In a formal economic model, that's going to cause a deadweight loss, and you may get more output if you get rid of some of that regulation, but you also create a more volatile environment, which one day may collapse around you. I mean, I look at the 2008, this is something I do teach and talk about a lot, the 2007, 8, 9 episode, and say, how much deadweight loss could make up, how much saving of deadweight loss could make up for the trillions of dollars of lost GDP in that recession? And we know why we got that recession. It was not a pandemic. It was a financial collapse. So that was a long-winded answer, I'm afraid.
That's okay. I have a long-winded question. So there've been a couple people in the audience who have wanted to talk a bit about international commerce. And so we kind of go back in time a bit. We have Democratic presidents, pushing for NAFTA and kind of liberalization in Latin America, the bailout of Mexico. We get a Republican president who kind of turns all that on its head. But it doesn't sound like the Democrats really are too excited about going back to the way it was. Where does TPP stand? What do we do with China, if anything? Maybe just some of your thoughts on this and how you think the new Democrats or the Republicans might handle this going forward?
Yeah, so let me just very, very briefly back up as you did. As you look back in history, which party has been more pro-trade and which has been more protectionist has changed in American history many, many times. And when I was young once, it was the Republican Party that was promoting trade and the Democratic Party that was more protectionist. In the Clinton years, which you just mentioned, this flipped. And under Bill Clinton's presidency, the Democratic Party, with NAFTA and WTO and other things, became very much pro-trade. And with some of the Republicans, by the way, there was some Republican objection, but a number of the Republicans went along. Now, both parties are protectionist. The reason that when I scribbled on a notepad about which issues I wanted to take up tonight, I didn't put down trade, is that the Trump Republicans are protectionists and a lot of the Democrats, most of the Democrats are protectionists. Now, I'm an economist as you are, and on the back of our union card, it says free trade is good. So that's where I am. I've had many, many arguments over the decades with Democratic members of Congress trying to persuade them of the virtues of David Ricardo and free trade, with not so much success. We had the most success in the Clinton years. So I don't think there's much of a difference between the two parties. on that. Now, you mentioned China. I think the difference on China is going to mainly be the bellicosity of the rhetoric. Trump has staked a lot on fomenting hatred of China. Biden has not. He will never talk that way. But in terms of trade policy, actual policy actions, it's not obvious that they would be that different on trade issues.
Okay, so we've had a couple more questions come in, and I also wanted to follow up a little bit more on taxes. So first off, I thought my understanding was Biden wouldn't have the expensing, so the cost of capital would increase. But again, maybe that's a second order issue.
Yeah, it is. There'll be acceleration, but not all the way to expensing.
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah. But then there were other questions about, again, I mean, if you read the Wall Street Journal, this is the editorial page. This is the most important question. What's the effect of taxes on the wealthy? One aspect of it, which I've highlighted recently, is a lot of the top earners are actually pass-through businesses, so this would have a similar impact, at least on somewhat, as a corporate tax increase, hitting capital and labor on those sides. There was one other response on Twitter yesterday. The rapper 50 Cent saw that the marginal tax rate top tax rate in New York City was going to go to 62%. So said that would make him switch his vote. Just more seriously, how important really do you think the top tax rate really is?
I think not very important. So let me pick, but not trivial. Let me pick up a few things, strands of what you asked about, Noah. First of all, the preferentially low tax rate on LLCs and other pass-through entities, I thought personally was one of the worst things in the Trump tax cut. You talk about distorting types of businesses, formation of businesses, and just passing more money to rich people. I thought it was egregious. So what you said is right. The taxation of those kinds of entities will go up, but I don't count that as a bad thing. I count that as a good thing. The marginal tax rates at the very top, I don't worry about so much, because the people at the very top, they have so much income, they don't even know how much income they have. So it's hard to imagine it's affecting their behavior right. Where I worry much more is about the marginal tax rates on quite prosperous but not super rich people. So for example, extending the payroll tax for Social Security out to infinity could be a quite large. Now, there is this donut hole that it ends at whatever, 135,000, and then it picks up again at 400,000. A lot of people live in that range and they won't get hit by it. But when you think about people that are above that range but are not making $10 million a year by any means, that's a sizable distortionary tax. And if I had my druthers, which of course I don't, I wouldn't do that.
Kim, did you have?
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. Hi. So maybe, I don't know if this is one more question but there's been a lot of interest both today and in the past about healthcare. Probably not too surprising. Both candidates are making very strong stances on it. We've had someone come in earlier talking about maybe healthcare as being one of the biggest long-term fiscal issues in the country. What's your take on this? What would Biden be doing, not just in terms of insurance, but in terms of maybe trying to bring down healthcare costs in general? Maybe I'll just leave it open like that for you. Okay, so let me start with the part you said is not just about insurance, but there's a clear, I didn't put it on the list because there is no Trump policy.
What there is he constantly says, I have a great policy, it's coming in 2 weeks. And he's been saying that for 4 years. So there is no Trump policy. There is a pretty clear Biden policy. He wants Obamacare plus. He wants to go down the Obamacare path, but further, including a public option and getting more of the country on Medicaid, I'm sorry, on the expanded Medicaid. I think both of those are great. I think that you can quarrel with the details, but the basic philosophy of Obamacare, which by no coincidence was the same as the basic philosophy of Romney Care in Massachusetts years before, is the practice. If you don't want to do Medicare for all, national health system like Britain, if you don't want to do that, then if that's the way to go, because you need to get everybody covered. And if you want to get everybody covered and actually have private insurance, everybody has to be in the pool, as they say, on the playground. So you really have to. So there are degrees of has got Obama back in 2010. They should have fought harder for the public option. For it might have been a more bare bones policy for poor people and so on, but they decided that they wouldn't, that maybe they would lose the political fight or so on. Biden wants that. There will be some revenue need implied by that, which I think is worked into the Biden, quote, budget. But I want to come back on that to what I said at the outset. He will not get exactly what he proposes in a platform. No president. Barack Obama certainly did not get exactly what he proposed. And I still remember bitter memories. Bill Clinton had a whole healthcare plan, which I spent about 1 million hours working on. He got nothing. So there's a lot of slips between cup and lip on that. So what would actually happen, who knows? But Biden wants to do more, and there will be some cost to doing more.
Okay, I have one question, which is maybe a little bit less about Trump versus Biden, but a little bit broader. I mean, you did bring up the Fed, which I think there's. Let me just put it this way: there's been a wide range of people put forward as potential nominees. I think some of them quite good, but some who didn't make it to appointments. But my question was more, worrying potentially about mission creep at the Fed. The Fed is kind of the one institution that seems to be functioning quite well and active, and there's also pushes now towards having them even have a broader mission, looking at tackling inequality, for instance.
Right.
I wonder if you want to say something about the role of the Fed and what they could and should be doing.
I've been on a number of Zoom webinars and things like that, and where I brought up mission creep. I think it's problematic. I think there already is some mission creep, and there are some politicians. Look, a number of politicians have discovered that the Fed doesn't have to raise taxes to do stuff. And that's great, because if they want to do stuff, they may have to raise taxes to pay for it. Or they could just blow the deficit to hell, which is what they think of more often these days. But the Fed doesn't have to worry about it. And, the Fed could, quote, print money, as we say. Enough politicians have caught on to that now that there is a danger of mission creep. Turn this over to the Fed and let them do it. We already have one fairly glaring but not very harmful example of this in what's called the Main Street Lending Facility. This was the US Treasury and the Congress. This was in the CARES Act, assigning to the Fed the job of providing loans or helping provide loans to medium-sized businesses, which the Fed first interpreted as very large but not gigantic businesses, and then has been climbing down the ladder. The Fed is very unsuited to that job. And what you, it doesn't have the expertise, it doesn't have the mechanics that go with a job like that. And what you see is that while Congress was looking, I'm trying to get the numbers right, I think for like $4 trillion of lending out of that, the Fed has done 20 billion or something, or maybe less than that. Now, it's not because they don't care or they think the economy is fabulous and doesn't need any of this. It's that it's the wrong place for that function. And much as I would like to see greater equality in the country, here's something you don't know about me, Noah. This is way before you knew me. When I was a kiddie doing a PhD dissertation, it was on income inequality. That's what I wrote my dissertation. So I've been a big, and I was against it, by the way, not for it. So I've been a big bear on policies that would equalize the income distribution for my entire professional life. But the Fed has doesn't have any instruments that it can use to do that. We have tax transfer systems, we have labor laws, we have lots of things, education, lots of things that we could aim at the inequality problem, and I'd like to see us aim more at that, but not monetary policy.
Okay, great. I think we'll have time for just one final, we're running over a little bit, but we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap. And again, I want to encourage, again, anyone who's interested to hang on afterwards, after we stop the recording.
So, Alan, there was one more question that close to the Wisconsinite's heart in almost every webinar, which is, what about manufacturing? So, can you just broadly speak to us a little bit about whether or not there are any specific policy proposals with respect to manufacturing, structural change? As you probably know, Wisconsin has a very high employment share in manufacturing compared to the nation as a whole. And so, this probably ties in with a couple of other things like trade policy, but I want to kind of just focus it back on specifically manufacturing, and if there's any sort of distinguishing policy proposals in the Biden platform that you could speak to.
There is something, but not that I can speak to, and I'll tell you why. This goes back with me a long time. I've learned a long time ago just to keep quiet about this with politicians. They think manufacturing is the be all and end all, that's the most important thing. And I say, no, all the good jobs are outside manufacturing, not all, but most of them are outside manufacturing. And this fixation on manufacturing, which all politicians have, basically, almost all of them, is a vestige of the industrial age. I mean, there was a time when manufacturing was the way to riches and to make your economy the leading economy in the world, or in the vanguard. And that's still true in some poor countries. But it's not true in the United States. It's not where the best jobs are. So when I see, and they come out of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, distortionary policies of all sorts to try to subsidize manufacturing, I wince. I think, gee, it's a good thing we didn't do that with agriculture back in 1802 and keep every American on the farm. But believe me, what I've just said to you will not be Joe Biden's attitude. And it will not be Kamala Harris's attitude. And it won't be Donald Trump's attitude. And it's not a concrete proposal, but that way of looking at the thing probably wouldn't get 2 votes in the United States Senate. I'm not sure it'll get any votes.
All right, well, that's a little bit of a down note, maybe to end on. But again, I want to thank Alan for joining us, and thank everyone for tuning in. We will stop the recording now, and anyone who's interested in hanging on afterwards, again, depending on the size of the audience that we get, we may split into breakout